Hi, in this video, we will discuss about exception hierarchy. Okay, what do you mean by exception hierarchy? We'll see with the help of one diagram. Okay, so this is what a diagram to represent this exception hierarchy. So when you talk about everything is in class in Java, right? Everything is class in Java. So what is the super class for these exceptions? So that is called throwable. Throwable, the super class in exception. Okay, in entire Java, in Java, object is the superclass. Okay, object is the superclass, but here throwable is superclass in exception. So throwable has two child classes. Those are error and exception. Okay, two classes. For this also, it is categorized into so many category, means so many things like so if you talk about runtime exception is one of the child of this exception. So IO exception, interrupted exception, remote exception, SQL exception, etc. There are so many exceptions are there. We cannot bring all these things to this PPT and we cannot explain all these things. But so with the help of few exceptions, we will understand what exactly the hierarchy is. So first it is throwable. This is the super class in exception. So for this, you have two child classes called one is exception, another one is error. So this exception is also categorized as runtime exception, IO exception, interrupted exception, remote exception, SQL exception, etc. So when you deep drill into this one, okay, when you dig into this one, so in the runtime exception, you have another child classes. So few of them are arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, class cost exception, illegal argument exception. So these are all comes under what? Runtime exception. And when you talk about IO exception, so file not found exception, socket exception, unknown host exception, end of file exception, these are all comes under IO exception. And when you talk about remote exception, connect exception, access exception, server exception, so these are all comes under remote exception. When you talk about SQL exception, so sync provider exception, serial exception, so SQL client info exception, so these are all comes under SQL exception. So these are all comes under exception class. Okay, so there are another exception, so many exceptions are under that. You have subclasses also. Okay, so but when you're coming to the error, so we already saw what is the difference between exception and error, right, in our previous video. So when you come into the error, you have multiple classes: linkage error, assertion error, virtual machine error, thread death error. So where if you go into the deeper in the linkage error, you have bootstrap method error, class format error, exception initialized error. When you talk about the virtual machine error, so internal error, out of memory error, stack overflow error. So these are comes under virtual machine error. These are comes under linkage error. Okay, so here also we have few more, but to describe all these things, I have taken few and I have taken this diagram to explain in detail. Okay, so throwable is the super class in exceptions. So this has two child classes called exception and error. Exception has so many child classes. Error also has so many child classes. For those child classes also, we have few more child classes. Okay, this is the hierarchy. So if somebody asks about this one, you can say with this, with the help of this, diagram, you can explain this much is enough. You cannot write each and every exception. This is enough. Okay. So what could be the possible inter-equation from this? Okay, so what is an exception, what is an error, difference between these two? Can you name few exceptions, can you name few errors, and you can you tell me the what is that this exception hierarchy? So throwable is the parent class. For that you have two child classes called error and exception. For the exception you have multiple exceptions. For error also you have multiple error classes. Okay, so that's all in this video. Thank you.